And in normal times, the poorest wage earner might spend a third or even half of his income on it. When it rose in price, his whole livelihood was threatened, since it left him with less for other food, clothing, heating, and rent, and opened the prospect of destitution. Those who wrote and spoke with such confidence about the rabble or dregs of the people fomenting disorders like those of 1775 had mostly never known what it was to calculate domestic budgets so finely. The vast majority of French people who were not destitute lived under constant threat of becoming so, and were prepared to use violence to avoid such a fate. When they did, they terrified the narrow, secure social elites who in normal times dominated urban life and who never had to worry about the price of a 4-pound loaf. These groups never made up more than a small proportion of the population of most towns, seldom beyond 1/5, and usually a good deal less. Among them were always a handful of successful master craftsmen, but the true hallmark of those in easy circumstances was that they did not work with their hands. Soft hands, formal clothing, servants, effortless literacy, and incomes and possessions far beyond the dreams of the average Frenchman or woman marked out the members of the dominant classes. There were scarcely more than 2 million of them, and all of them, except a few 100,000 nobles and clerics, were members of the middle class, the bourgeoisie. There were more than twice as many bourgeois under Louis XVI as in the last years of Louis XIV. Over the same period, the population as a whole had grown only about a quarter, so that relative weight of the bourgeoisie in society was increasing even more rapidly than their numbers. Their share of national wealth was enormous. Most industrial and almost all commercial capital, amounting to almost a fifth of all French private wealth, was bourgeois owned. Perhaps a quarter of the land belonged to them, and a significant, though uncertain, proportion of government stock. So probably did the greater part of the capital invested in a field that had proved peculiarly successful in France since the 16th century, venal public offices. Bourgeois competition for such offices was pushing the price of many of them to unprecedented heights by the 1780s. Bourgeois spending was also reflected in the handsome new architecture that was transforming the appearance of so many towns, and in the expansion of the luxury trades. Most of the demand for Lyon silk, sugar, and coffee from the West Indies, and decorative materials such as prints and wallpaper came from bourgeois taste. Bourgeois capital helped to build lavish new theaters in Paris and provincial cities like Bordeaux and Nantes. Bourgeois ticket buyers kept them solvent. Bourgeois keenness to invest in education and culture funded a remarkable expansion in schools and colleges. Booming growth in the book market and important new developments such as the establishment of newspapers, public libraries, reading rooms, and innumerable clubs and cultural societies. All this was spectacular evidence that as the poor grew poorer and more numerous, the rich too were growing in numbers and getting richer. The distance, wrote Mercier in 1783, which separates the rich from other citizens is growing daily, and poverty becomes more insupportable at the sight of the astonishing progress of luxury which tires the view of the indigent. Hatred grows more bitter, and the state is divided into two classes, the greedy and insensitive and murmuring malcontents. The ultimate source of this enrichment was the extraordinary commercial and industrial expansion of the 18th century. All bourgeois fortunes began in business, and more were being made as the century progressed. The greatest success stories caught every eye. The mode of living that takes place here among merchants, wrote Young in Bordeaux, is highly luxurious. Their houses and establishments are on expensive scales, great entertainments, and many served on plate. High play is a much worse thing, and the scandalous chronicle speaks of merchants keeping the dancing and singing girls of the theater at salaries which ought to import no good to their credit. All this was a world away from the traditional picture of the sober, frugal, calculating, parfait négociant, celebrated by Jacques Savary in a famous and much reprinted manual of 1675. But it was doubtless a world away, too, from the lives of most of those engaged in trade or business. Among the bourgeoisie, as among all social groups, the opulent handful stood out much more than the modest majority. Yet, fundamentally, the differences were largely a matter of scale. In many ways, the behavior of the commercial bourgeoisie was much the same at whatever level it occurred. Hardly any of them, above all, were content to leave money where it had been made. Trade and manufacture, however profitable, were not secure. And so, as soon as there was money to spare, the first instinct was to buy land with it, while wholesale colonial shippers or metropolitan bankers used their millions to accumulate manors, country houses, or far-flung lordships in choice locations. Successful small-town tradesmen picked up houses down the street or patches of garden outside the walls. Land was safe. Its profits might be low, but they were steady. Above all, land had prestige. All the best people and the people who had governed the country since time immemorial were land owners. Nobody, therefore, with any aspirations to social consequence could afford to be landless. And those whose ambitions were really serious knew that sooner or later they would have to get out of trade altogether. Very few bourgeois families remained in the business that had enriched them for more than a single generation, unless they were Protestants or Jews debarred by law from everything except making money. Profits not spent on buying property went into buying the next generation a superior education. With that, the way was open to the professions, where mercantile origins could be forgotten. This pattern was very long established, and although it was becoming fashionable to extol the usefulness of merchants and lament the way they abandoned their calling as soon as it had enriched them, there was little sign that much was changing in practice. "I ought not to pass over in silence," wrote a Lyon litigant about his adversary in 1780. "I, who am the offspring of a generally loved and respected merchant, the outrage done by Mr. Guest to commerce in describing those whose exercise this profession as persons from the dregs of the people. It is thus that he speaks of a profession as honorable as it is honored in its country. Yet remember that Mr. Guest is, as I am, a merchant's son. He disowns his stock, whereas I honor mine." The writer, however, was a judge in a local court. Evidently, the paternal calling was chiefly to be honored for producing enough money to buy the son an office. And nothing testifies more eloquently to the continuing desire of the bourgeoisie to escape from the stigma of commerce than the booming market for offices. Originating in the 16th century as a way of enabling the king to borrow money. In the 17th, the sale of public offices became a basic institution of French social life, when office holders were permitted, on payment of an annual tax, to pass them on to their children or resell them to third parties. This made offices as sound a social investment as land. And in response to continued demand, the crown made most public functions venal. The whole judicial hierarchy, from the highest presidents in the parliaments to the humble tipstaff in the obscurest rural jurisdiction, bought their positions. So did thousands of other public officials at all levels. Under Louis XVI, there were over 70,000 venal offices, representing a capital value of perhaps 900 million livres, increasing rapidly as the market value of most of them went up. Only offices traditionally closed to bourgeois, like those in the parliaments, or ones which seemed threatened by perpetual fiscal tinkering, were failing to rise in value. All the rest were shooting up under the impulsion of the bourgeoisie's seemingly insatiable desire for a life of respectable professional dignity, as far removed as possible from the hurly-burly of business. It seemed to matter little that few fortunes were made in the professions. It was true that people like notaries could do very well in Paris or the more prosperous provincial centers. A talented, or as many thought, plain lucky handful might shine and prosper at the bar. For the first time in history, too, there were writers who found it possible to live by their pens. But all these success stories were exceptional. The lot, and often indeed the aim of most professional bourgeois, was to vegetate in modest, undemanding, but comfortable circumstances, finding wives of similar background and being succeeded in their office, or calling by their children and grandchildren. Maximilien Robespierre, destined to become the most famous provincial bourgeois of his time, came from a family that had practiced law in Artois for 5 generations. And before 1788, it does not seem to have occurred to him to do anything else either. In sleepy provincial Arras, he made a modest living at the bar from such cases as came his way, supplemented his income with a petty judgeship in one of the myriad special jurisdictions to be found anywhere, read read widely in his ample spare time, wrote poems and entered literary competitions, and became a member of the local academy. In other towns, innumerable counterparts lived similar humdrum, unexciting lives. Many sought to spice them up by joining Masonic lodges with their high ideals and mystic, supposedly secret rituals. Others found diversion in the countless occasions offered by the narrow, under-occupied world of middle-class self-esteem for feeling slighted, nursing petty triumphs or resentments, or pursuing vicious little quarrels and vendettas. Excluded from a discussion group formed by other local lawyers, Robespierre denounced them in a bitter pamphlet. In Grenoble, another small-town lawyer, Antoine Pierre Barnave, enjoyed being recognized as the man who, at the age of 10, had been thrown with his mother out of an empty theater box reserved for a noble friend of the provincial governor. It made the bourgeois and Protestant Barnaves into social and religious martyrs, a distinction they clearly treasured. Barnave later claimed the incident gave his life a mission: to raise the caste to which he belonged from the state of humiliation to which it seemed condemned. But the determination of his pretentious mother to use the famous box while his father sat in the pit is a vivid example of the most burning of bourgeois obsessions, their love-hate relationship with the nobility. The most highly regarded of all bourgeois were those who lived nobly. That meant they lived without exercising any profession, on the proceeds of investments or landed revenues. Bourgeois living nobly were a rare breed, however, since anybody who could afford to live like a noble could equally well afford to become one. And ennoblement was the ultimate recognition of social success that all bourgeois dreamed of. Nor did men of means find it hard to achieve. Over 4,000 of the most sought-after venal offices conferred nobility on their holders, and by this and a number of less important avenues, perhaps 10,000 individuals, which if their families are included means up to 45,000 people, left the bourgeoisie for the nobility in the course of the 18th century, a rate of 2 people per day. Most ennobling offices, it is true, required 2 successive generations to hold them, if the nobility thereby acquired was to be fully hereditary. But the 857 offices of King's Secretary, with no duties to speak of, ennobled completely and at once soap for scum, savonnette à vilain, they were called. But they were much in demand among financiers, merchants, and industrialists who pushed their price to unparalleled heights in the 1780s. Nothing outraged the professional bourgeoisie more than to see self-made businessmen, leapfrogging them into the highest levels of society. It made nonsense of their assumptions that tradesmen or of whatever sort were their inferiors. But the prices parvenus were prepared to pay put most ennobling offices far beyond the reach of professional men, however worthy. All they could do was petition, as the members of local civil and criminal courts constantly did, to have their own offices made ennobling ones, or try to get away with usurping noble status. Forging false genealogies was a minor industry, and the number of later revolutionary leaders who tried to make their names sound noble is striking. Before 1789, we meet Danton, de Robespierre, and de Marat, while Brissot qualified himself de Warville, and Roland de la Platière. Nor was it any consolation to know that nobles thought little of brash intruders into their order either. When parliaments voted, as several did between the 1760s and 1780s, not to admit members without several generations of noble ancestry, or when in 1781 the notorious Ségur Ordonnance decreed that army officers would henceforth need at least 4 degrees of nobility. Bourgeois' opinion was shocked. These measures were largely directed against the same moneyed interest whose ability to buy their way into the nobility so disturbed professional people's sense of propriety. But from outside, they looked like attempts to exclude all bourgeois from the most desirable public employments. In practice, few bourgeois had ever got that far without becoming noble first. But to formalize the situation publicly was provocative in an age when the education, values, and outlook of nobles and bourgeois were increasingly indistinguishable. What then made nobility so desirable? Obviously, there was the glamour, distinction, and recognition that noble status had always brought. Then there was a range of privileges which all nobles enjoyed. The bourgeoisie were themselves no strangers to privilege in a society where most people benefited from some special rights or exemptions by virtue of the corporations, groups, towns, or even provinces to which they belonged. Privilege was the hallmark of a country without uniform laws or institutions. But nobles were entitled to more privileges than most. They formed a separate order or an estate in society, and all the rest of the king's subjects from the most wretched beggar to Young's great colonial shipper dining off plate, were roturiers, commoners. Nobles took precedence on public occasions, carried swords, and made display of social coats of arms. They were entitled to trial in special courts, and even to a distinctive mode of execution, decapitation, if convicted of a capital offense. They were not subject to the corvée, billeting of troops, or conscription into the militia. Above all, they enjoyed substantial fiscal advantages. They escaped much of the weight of the gabelle, the hated, extortionate salt monopoly. They paid no mutation duties on transferring feudal property, franc fief, and nobility conferred exemption from the basic direct tax, the taille. It was true that many bourgeois escaped it too, as citizens of towns which had been granted exemption, and that many nobles in the Pays d'Etat, where it fell on lands, not persons, found themselves subject to it, while non-noble neighbors owning fiefs were not. And there were certainly no exemptions for nobles from more recent direct taxes, such as the capitation of 1695 and the vingtième of 1749. But taille exemption remained, in most people's eyes, the quintessential badge of nobility, a tangible link with chivalric times when those whose duty was to risk their lives to defend the country were not expected to contribute money as well. The same warrior associations made it dishonorable for nobles to engage in retail trade. Those who did so risked loss of status, dérogations, and reduction to the ranks of the taillables. Few chose to imperil the advantages of nobility by flouting this law or the deep prejudices which lay behind it. In any case, they had their children to think of. Nobility was a family affair, a distinction only truly worth having if it could be passed on down the generations. Besides, nobles were presumed to have more important things to do than make their fortunes. They were society's traditional rulers, yet another reason why aspiring bourgeois were so keen to join them. Nobody knew or knows for certain how many nobles there were. Credible estimates vary between 120,000 and 350,000. But members of this tiny fragment of the nation owned between a quarter and a third of the land, and most of the feudal rights over the rest. They owned all the most valuable venal offices, huge amounts of government stock, and up to a quarter of the church's revenues went into the pockets of noble priests and monks. Most heavy industry was noble controlled, either through investments or outright ownership in fields like mining and metallurgy, which, being land-based, were not deemed commercial. Even the prohibition on trading had its loopholes. Wholesale trade had been open to nobles for generations. And kings' secretaries, most of whom were great merchants or financiers, were not required to give up business on purchase of this ennobling office. And because it was so easy for successful bourgeois to join the nobility in this way, the wealth of the order was constantly being supplemented by the riches they brought in with them, not to mention the dowries of bourgeois heiresses with which impecunious gentlemen were always eager to regild their arms. Thus, the growing wealth of the bourgeoisie also enriched the nobility and helped it maintain its leading position. Nobility was a club which every wealthy man felt entitled, indeed obliged, to join. Not all nobles by any means were rich, but sooner or later, all the rich ended up noble. And along with noble wealth went influence and power. The king, the first gentleman of the realm, passed his whole life among noble courtiers. Technically, only those with long pedigrees might even meet him. All his ministers were nobles. It caused a sensation in 1776 when Louis XVI gave office to Jacques Necker, a Swiss Protestant commoner. All the senior members of the administration, ambassadors, governors, councillors of state, intendants, were nobles, as were all senior military and naval officers, and most junior ones too. Most of the great financiers and tax farmers who've kept central government solvent had invested in nobility, and since every office in every sovereign court was an ennobling one, the whole upper judiciary were members of the order. In the church, nobles occupied all bishoprics and all the choicest abbacies and canonries. And under Louis XVI, it became a matter of policy that they should. The motive was one that lay behind the Ségur Ordonnance of 1781. To reserve some part of the public service for a group without other resources, the poor nobility. For in reality, France under Louis XVI was governed not by the nobility, but by a plutocracy in which the majority of nobles had no share. Half or more of the nobility were no better off than the average bourgeois, and many were a good deal poorer. The nobility of Bologna, noted Tobias Smollett in 1763, are vain, proud, and poor and slothful. They allow their country houses to go to decay, and their gardens and fields to waste, and reside in dark holes in the upper town, without light, air, or convenience. There they starve within doors, that they may have the wherewithal to purchase fine clothes and appear dressed once a day. They have no education, no taste for reading, no housewifery, no indeed in any earthly occupation, but that of dressing their hair and adorning their bodies. They hate walking and would never go abroad if they were not stimulated by the vanity of being seen. They pretend to be jealous of their rank, and will entertain no correspondence with merchants, whom they term plebeians. At court and in Paris, wealth opened every door, and dukes and peers happily married the well-endowed daughters of great financiers. Necker's passport to power was his opulence as a banker. There was similar mingling of rank and riches in some provincial capitals, especially if they were ports, but away from such centers of conspicuous consumption. The nobility often consisted of threadbare gentry with impeccable lineages but no resources. These were the only nobles most peasants, and therefore most French people, ever came across. They found them haughty, keen to exact their feudal dues and exercise their seigneurial prerogatives, and ferociously attached to their ancestry and privileges as noblemen. It generally happened, recalled Count de Ségur in 1825, looking back on the years before the Revolution, that there was less cause of complaint against the higher nobility or persons attached to the court than against the country nobility, who were poor and unenlightened. This ought to occasion no surprise, for the latter had nothing but their titles, which they were continually opposing to the real superiority of some of the middle classes, whose knowledge and wealth embarrassed and humbled them. Among nobles of this sort, prejudice against trade was at its most virulent. In Brittany, gentlemen fallen on hard times were allowed to put their nobility to sleep, while they restored their fortunes in commerce. But even those who did so, like Chateaubriand's father, who eventually managed to buy back the ancestral castle, spent all they had made in the process, and were then content to resume lives of straitened but genteel idleness. Lack of money closed the judicial bench to such people. The price of offices was beyond them, nor could they have afforded the education indispensable for sovereign court magistrates. They took solace in sneering at what they chose, erroneously often enough, to think of as the recent origins of the nobility of the robe. They saw themselves, on the contrary, as the only true nobility, a nobility of the sword. Their vocation, inherited with the blood of their ancestors, was to fight. They had a duty to serve the king, as officers, of course, in his armies. And he, in turn, had a duty to give them that opportunity. The problem was that all military commissions were subject to purchase. And here again, plutocrats priced them out of the market. In mid-century, there had been a lively public debate about the problem of the poor nobility. In La Noblesse Commerçante of 1756, the Abbé Coyer had argued that the solution was to encourage them to trade. But in La Noblesse Militaire ou Le Patriote Français, the Chevalier d'Arc, illegitimate grandson of Louis XIV, responded by denouncing the power of money and advocating a noble monopoly of military commissions with promotion on merit alone. This would give both poor nobles a guaranteed livelihood and make for more dedicated professional officers. Such debates culminated in 1776 in the establishment of a system of 12 military schools like that of Brienne, where young Napoleon Bonaparte, from a poor noble family in newly acquired Corsica, learned the rudiments of the military arts. The Ségur Ordonnance had the same aim: to purge the body of army officers of rich playboys just up from the bourgeoisie, more interested in the glamour and social recognition of a uniform than in military efficiency. The flaw was that it did nothing about courtier playboys, whose pedigrees were excellent, who were just as rich, but whose commitment to the military life was just as token. Either way, those with talent or abilities seemed doomed to take second place to people endowed by chance of birth with riches or noble ancestors. And not only in the army, the whole of society, many thought, worked too obviously in this way. What being is most alien to those around him, mused Chamfort, a self-made man of letters whose aristocratic contacts propelled him into the Académie Française in 1781. Might it not perchance be a man of merit, without gold or title deeds, in the midst of those who possess one of these two advantages, or both together? It was scarcely a coincidence that public dissatisfaction should become focused on the army. The record of the French armed forces in the wars of mid-century had been lamentable. Swept from the seas by the British and mauled on the battlefield by the Prussians, no other institutions had had their inadequacies so spectacularly demonstrated. Reforms like the introduction of military academies and the Segur Ordinance were part of a sustained attempt to restore the tarnished prestige of an army that had been the admiration of Europe in the days of Louis XIV. That role had now been inherited by the army of Frederick the Great, and it provided the model of many of the French reforms. Successive war ministers sought not only to build a Prussian-style officer corps, but also introduced Prussian tactics and maneuvers. Prussian uniforms, and even Prussian discipline. Controversy raged over every aspect of this policy, and polemics flew over such questions as whether French soldiers could honorably be punished for military offenses in the German way by beating with the flat of a sword. And certainly, Louis XVI's army was very differently constituted from that of Frederick. Most of his soldiers were his own subjects, and volunteers too. There were indeed 23 foreign regiments, including the redoubtable Swiss Guards, permanently attached to the royal household, but they barely accounted for 1/7 of the entire strength. And conscription was only used to recruit the militia. A reserve army never now mobilized except in wartime. Lots were drawn to select the conscripts required from each district. But exemption was so widespread that only the poorest peasants failed to avoid the draw. Even though the risk of the militia being embodied was now small, it was deeply unpopular in the countryside. The military life had little appeal for even the most miserable of peasants. The ranks of the regular army were drawn overwhelmingly from the highly urbanized, heavily garrisoned northern and eastern frontier districts. Most recruits stayed with the colors for the full 8 years of their engagement, and losses of 3,000 a year through desertion were low by international standards. So was the relative weight of the military in society. The 180,000 strong army represented one soldier for every 156 of the king's subjects, as compared with 1 in 29 in Prussia. And its regional concentration meant it impinged little on the lives of whole provinces in the center, south, and west of the country. French troops had not fought on their own soil for 3 generations, and in the 18th century they were seldom called upon to deal with civil unrest. Despite, therefore, the increasing sums being spent on it, the army was becoming more and more a world apart, making little impact on areas or populations not already militarized for generations. But even within the army, there were separate worlds. Most officers, endowed with generous leave, saw little of their subordinates and cared less. The Prussian models, so fashionable among military theorists, which called for mindless automatons in the ranks, did nothing to bring them closer together, nor did attempts to restrict access to commissions. In their anxiety to exclude rich commoners, they also kept out or kept down talented officers of fortune with long and valuable experience in other lower ranks. Such distance was impossible in the Navy, where a ship's complement all lived on top of one another for months on end, and each officer needed a thorough understanding of navigation and the duties of a crew. It was true that throughout the French Navy's history, repeated attempts had been made to restrict the recruitment of officers to nobles, naval schools, Compagnie de Garde de la Marine at Brest, Rochefort, and Toulon were intended to supply all the service's needs and were theoretically open only to nobles. But the latter found far less attraction in the rigors of seagoing than in the army. And although the red officers produced by the schools dominated the service, in wartime they were outnumbered by blues, recruited from a wide spectrum of maritime society. There was no purchase in the Navy, and few courtiers were interested in even the highest ranks. So social rivalries were far less pronounced at every level. What counted at sea was competence and experience, and ever since the time of Colbert, a system of naval conscription had operated in order to ensure that even the lower decks had these qualities. In coastal districts and in navigable river valleys, every man under 60 with experience afloat was required to register for assignment to a class or naval reserve category, liable for mobilization if the need arose. The system was as unpopular among sailors, fishermen, and bargemen as the draw for the militia was among peasants. But it produced better crews for warships than the British press gang, and ones which had their revenge on the British during the American War of Independence. This war seemed to vindicate the massive program of naval expansion and re-equipment that had been pursued since the end of the previous one in 1763. By 1780, there were 86 frigates and 79 ships of the line in French service, and the annual cost of the Navy almost quadrupled between 1776 and 1783. These efforts were crucial in securing American independence, and even after the war ended, Louis XVI remained determined to keep France a major naval power. The only time he saw the sea or visited any of his kingdom outside the Ile-de-France before 1791 was in 1786, when he traveled to Cherbourg to inspect progress on a vast new naval harbor. 3,000 men were employed on the works, which deeply impressed Arthur Young when he viewed them late in August 1788. Young wondered, however, whether such a stupendous project could be completed without bankrupting the kingdom. In fact, it took another 65 years to complete, and defense spending on this scale had already brought bankruptcy just 11 days before Young arrived in Cherbourg. Okay, I'll stop there.